Welcome to Creative Culture, a show that is quite literally about how creative people shape culture. My name is Steve Ramsey, and I believe it's the dreamers of the world that shape humanity. It's the artists, poets, musicians, authors, and makers who inspire us to be curious about the universe and expand our worldviews. This is a podcast that hopes to make the world a kinder, more understanding place, one creative thinker at a time. Quick reminder, if you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please consider checking out the video version over on YouTube. It's got real moving pictures and everything. The channel is really growing, and I'd like for you to join us. It's a whole different experience over there. You can find the show at Creative Culture Pod on YouTube. And you can also get updates on Instagram, also at Creative Culture Pod. Thank you for enjoying this podcast and sticking with me as it's evolved over the past 3 years. Vasi Birchwood is an artist and daily wearer of historic fashion, largely representing the working class Victorian era, but also from other periods such as clothing worn by common people in medieval times. She is also interested in recreating indigenous clothing from her heritage, the Volga Tatars. And if you're wondering where she gets these clothes, well, she makes them herself, sewing them by hand without a sewing machine. This is historical fashion, not vintage clothing. Vasi's YouTube channel, V Birchwood, is a fascinating look into the past, and what she uncovers goes beyond strictly fashion. She dives into topics such as Victorian makeup, medieval food, romantic era literature, as well as sewing tutorials. Most importantly, I love her philosophy on life, and I hope to get more into that. She's joining us today from her home in Europe. This is going to be a fascinating discussion. Vasi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So, okay, you got to describe what is it that you're wearing right now?
Yeah, so this is a late 19th century, early 20th century working class Volga Tatar dress. And it's the piece that I would say gave me the confidence to really dive into sewing other Volga Tatar clothing, because there's no patterns for this. There's like a couple of books that are, one of them is out of print, the other one is kind of hard to get. And they just have these diagrams and all this information about Volga Tatar clothing. And over the last 2 years, I've had to piece together all this research and figure out how was the stuff actually made. And so when I finally was able to draft this one and actually make it and have it come into fruition, it totally changed my relationship with understanding how to approach Volga Tatar clothing. And so it gave me the confidence boost that I needed to be able to then make more of it and figure out and really feel like I had a good grasp of what was actually going on at the time, sewing wise.
And who are the Volga Tatar? That's a part of Russia?
Yeah, so we're indigenous people of present day Russia. So so there's there's indigenous people all over the world, in Canada and present day United States and Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand. There is also indigenous people of present day Russia. And so, the Volga Tatars, we are, I think, the second largest ethnic minority group. And there's, I think, around 4 million of us, so quite a few. And we have our own culture, language, food, all sorts of things. And it's really, really important to me to preserve it and to also, I guess, encourage other Tatars and other indigenous people around the world to get more connected with their culture.
And so this piece that you're wearing right now that you made, again, what era, what time period would have this been worn?
So the late 19th century into the early 20th century, you start to see Volga Tatar clothing take on more of a European sort of flair. They're really inspired by European fashion because of trade, I guess, and just, things becoming more globalized at that point. And so you start to see their more classic tunic-like cut dresses, which are more inspired by Central Asia and East Asian fashion. And you start to see them transform into these subtly Victorian, subtly Edwardian shapes. Like you get this gather on the sleeve here, and suddenly the sleeve is on a curve, which is really interesting because earlier Tatar clothing, you get the sleeve on a straight cut, which is really fascinating. All of a sudden, they've totally changed this. It's kind of a huge shift. And yeah, so this is what working women would have worn, and it's very pretty, and also I think quite practical because it's just made of like a linen cotton, and it's
Right.
really flowy. And also one of the best things about Tatar clothing is that, and a lot of historical clothing, in fact, is that it changes with your body. So everybody's body will naturally change throughout their lives. That's completely normal. And I think in society today, we have this like hesitation when bodies will change because we're taught that we must fit into a certain shape and a certain size. And people are given a lot of pressure to never change, even though that's what will happen. That's just the natural way of things. In fact, it's a privilege, I think, to grow old and for your body to change. And one of the beautiful things about historical clothing is all of it is like fully adjustable, especially in working class clothing.
Yeah.
So you don't really get this thing of like clothing being super, I guess, form fit and very, what's the right word for it? Just like super form fit and very tailored to you in working class stuff. You don't really get that as much as you do with like middle and upper class fashion.
Right.
And when it comes to Volga Tatar clothing specifically, all of it is like fully adjustable and really friendly for the natural changes of the body and
Well,
just
and
throughout
that's
time.
so much better for the environment too. I mean, just think about
Yeah.
the fast fashion industry today that is like convincing us that we have to have this massive wardrobe because of, like you say, changes in our body. Oh, I might put on a few pounds, but I better keep those pants, around just in case I lose the weight again. And so, yeah, none of this stuff is adjustable anymore. And I think that this is all due to just so much of this consumerism based around clothing today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I understand, like, I think fast fashion for people, especially who are lower income, it's really important that it is accessible. So, because people need clothes at the end of the day, and it takes a lot of time and money and energy to make your own clothing. And for people who are lower income and struggling to pay their bills, that time is not a possibility. And so, but those people are generally the ones repairing their fast fashion stuff. They're generally the ones that are treating it very carefully and wearing it until it's in shreds. It's not like the fast fashion that bothers me, which is maybe influencers who are buying these massive hauls of some company that's really corrupt and
It's
unethical.
crazy. I
Yeah.
mean, it's out of control. These influencers on Instagram who are just coming with these unboxing videos like it was like seasonal clothing, but now it's like every month. They're like
Yeah.
trying to convince you you've got to buy new clothes.
Yeah, so the cool thing about my wardrobe is that my clothes, if I just keep repairing them, might last me like 40 years.
That's
So I
amazing.
love making clothes because I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
this is not like a clothing item I'm going to wear for a month. This is something that I'm going to get to keep in
Yeah.
my wardrobe forever, hopefully.
That's that is so incredible. And well, I would imagine like this particular dress you're wearing now would have been there was probably photographs existed by that period of time, so you have somewhat of a frame of reference to go by.
Yeah.
I don't know how many Volga Tatars were photographed at the turn of the 20th century, but I'm sure you must have found some photographs.
Yeah, so there's photographs. We have like lovely historians that have done the work to even reconstruct some of it. But I'm really grateful that I can at least speak Russian because a lot of the materials for it are in Russian. And
Mm.
so that's very, very helpful for me because I have a little bit of an easier time. There isn't a lot of information in the English language about this stuff. So that's part of my purpose as well, is to be able to sort of connect Volga Tatars more together and be able to get the information, because there are Volga Tatars that live in other parts of the world that maybe don't speak Russian and don't speak Tatar. And so for them, it's really important that they get this information presented to them in the English language because it's a language that often binds a lot of us together. And yeah, so, and also just to get other people who aren't Volga Tatar excited about indigenous people, excited about indigenous handicrafts, and just all of these things that make up our cultures.
I suppose the most common question you get asked is from strangers? Why are you dressed in these clothes? Are you cosplaying? Are these the types of questions that are common?
People leave me alone a lot nowadays. I don't know why.
Because they all know you. They're like, oh yeah, that's Vasi. She just goes around wearing these old dresses.
My friends, like, they love it. I have some really amazing friends that are like, so I love my friends so much. I have a
Oh, I'm
really,
sure they love it. I mean, like strangers. Do
yeah,
strangers like just want to like have like take selfies with you and stuff and think that they're like, oh, we're at a Renaissance fair or something?
I think it depends where you are. So, like, I remember once I was in London visiting some friends, and we went to like a very touristy area, and there, like, every 5 seconds I was getting asked to take a photo, and it was like really hard for me to just enjoy my life because I'm happy to take photos sometimes, depending on where I am, obviously. But yeah, just it was really hard for me to even walk the whole street because I just kept getting stopped for photos, and I felt really flattered and appreciated that they liked my clothing so much. Because, when you make it yourself, when
Yeah.
someone likes your clothing, it's not just a compliment of like, oh, you look nice. It's also like, this is my art that I spent hundreds of hours making. It's a massive honor to be able to have someone say, like, this is so beautiful. And they don't even realize you necessarily made it. So it
Hmm.
kind of hits on a different level, this sort of inner pride of oh, I made this too. And that always, I think, really surprises people because um, I think about before I started sewing. So I started sewing about 3.5 years ago, and I'm all self-taught.
Whoa, you've only been doing this for 3.5 years?
Yeah, yeah. So my grandmother sews and my mother sews. So when I was a kid, I like ran a straight stitch on a machine or like, did like little things, but I never made clothes. And the machine always really overwhelmed me. But I felt so amazed by people who could sew. I thought it was like the skill that if you knew how to sew, you could do anything in the world. I truly just idolized people who could sew when I was a kid. And I used to watch like Project Runway and all these things too. So I
Oh.
was like really, interested in sewing and clothing making. And yeah, so around 3.5 years ago, I think I'm coming up to, it was like August 2021 or something. I don't remember the date, but
Wow.
yeah, I started sewing and I went for it. And the
Was that
thing
was
that
that kind of like a pandemic project? Like, oh gosh, I need something to do with my time.
No, not at all. It was like I had been planning to before the pandemic started, and it just wasn't the right situation. So I was living in Iceland at the time, and it was like really expensive to get sewing supplies. And I also was convinced that the only way I could make clothing was by a machine.
Hmm.
And so later, I don't know, I moved to the UK after that, and suddenly shipping prices for fabric and sewing supplies became way easier. There was a lot more choice and variety that I could access the materials I needed. And I also realized, oh, I can sew everything by hand, just with a needle and thread. I don't need a machine. Because it was always the idea of sewing machines that stopped me. I have these memories of my beautiful grandmother sitting on the machine and the noise just like jarring my ears and being like, oh, and then like something would happen, like the needle would snap and like go flying at her, just like
Wow.
workplace injury potential. And so I just decided, okay, machines are not for me. How are we going to approach this differently?
What's that feeling like for you to sew by hand? Now, I'm going to compare this to what I do, woodworking. There are
Yeah, it's
people
like
like
woodwork.
me who use the power tools and are into that, but there is this whole other group who are just interested in hand tools, and they always kind of talk about that more of a connection to the material. Do
Yeah.
you feel any of that?
Absolutely. That's it. It's calming and you feel so connected to your clothing on a way that you can't even really express to people unless they've done something fully by hand. And I really don't think hand sewing is superior or something. I think sometimes us hand sewers get boxed into being a bit pretentious or something. I actually think machinery, like I work in tech, I work as a colorist, I work around computers all day. I
Yeah.
think machines and technology are amazing. I think they're incredible tools. It's just they're not for some people. And so for hand sewing, I really wanted to feel the therapeuticness of it. I wanted to feel
Yeah.
deeply connected to what I was doing. And for me, the machine just wasn't going to get me there. So that's why approaching it by hand was different. And also for me, like when I sew my indigenous clothing by hand, I feel so connected to my ancestors in a way that I can't even express, because I constantly think about my great 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 grandmother at that time, like in the 19th century, sewing the same kind of garments with her own hands. And it just takes you into this other world where you feel sort of just like struck by awe at the ability for it to connect me to her, and it gives me chills to even talk about it, because it's like these people who we've never met, maybe don't have a tangible relationship with now, but that we can kind of always carry this little piece of them with us. And I think that that's something that, like, if I sewed by machine, I just don't think I could get that same feeling of feeling that connected to the women that came before me, who would make their own clothing.
Yeah, it sounds like almost a meditation while you're sewing. Do you like completely shut out the outside world while or do you just get in the zone, or do you listen to music, or how does that process play out?
Yeah, every time is different. I think it's the same with meditation. Like every time you sit down to meditate or active meditation, it's going to show up in a completely different way. Just like the weather shows up differently every day, and we can't really predict how it's going to appear, but we just sort of have to go with what's showing up. And make space for that. And so that's how I approach sewing. I just kind of try and commit to either sewing little bits every day for periods of time. So an upcoming video I have is that I actually did like an extended sewing challenge where I showed up every day. The video is not out yet, but it will be at some point. I'm still working on it. And that kind of was an interesting process, because I realized I don't know if I like this consistency fully of showing up each day for like 5 or 10 minutes. And I realized the balance for me is committing to some amount of consistent sewing, but then also balancing that out with just allowing myself to create, to play. Because I think being in the state of creativity is very playful. And it's almost like with children, we have to give them the space to just play, to experiment, to explore. And this is something that we very often lose as adults, the space to just make and not worry about the outcome of it, or how much time we have left, or how into it we're going to get. And so just about allowing it to just have the freedom to do that, I realized is really important for me, because getting in that creative state, it's really hard to do that if you're feeling like the pressure or the stress of having to get something done.
Yeah, and that's just it. And I mean, I'm going through a lot of this myself right now, is like trying to find a way of producing art without, I mean, obviously you make art, you want the world to see it, but also it needs to be something that you take time for yourself. And I'm kind of wondering how much of kind of this demand of social media and now YouTube places on what you're doing and how that affects your sewing.
My sewing, I don't think gets too affected by it. So I have kind of created really strong boundaries around how often I release sewing content, because that's the nice thing about my channel is I like to talk about a lot of things other than just hand sewing. I work on other projects as well, because I never
And
want.
you don't do a whole lot of just like tutorials, so you don't have to set up the camera while you're sitting there, So.
Yeah, I purposely intentionally did it that way, because I realized that at some point down the line it's not sustainable, and that I'm going to end up really disliking my craft, which is not something that I want. And so I also am incredibly passionate about filmmaking, and I have been for a long time. And this is like what I do in my job, outside of YouTube. And so, I mean, YouTube, I guess, is arguably sometimes filmmaking as well.
Yeah.
But, that's why I really sometimes like to just put a lot of intention into like creating little films, short films for YouTube. And so sometimes I will make a video like that instead, just to be able to mix things up a little. And it's always all related to historical fashion and sewing. But I think that the thing about historical fashion and what I do is that it extends far beyond just the superficialness of fashion. Fashion is an incredibly deep topic. And I think that a lot of people see fashion as vanity, or I don't know, like a self-absorbed appearance kind of thing. But fashion, it tells us the story of people. It tells us their beliefs, their culture, deeper symbolisms and insights into what they were doing, what they thought at the time. It's like food. We can eat food, we can look at food, but food is also fuel and food is also necessary, but food is also culture and it's language and it's community and connection. And fashion is the exact same thing. And I think that sometimes people see historical fashion as just like a hobby or costuming or this or that. And it can be, absolutely. It's a very fun hobby for people. But I also think for a lot of people, it means so much more. It's about them connecting to the earth, to what they're making, to themselves, to their communities, to their ancestors. And so with my channel, I've always tried to emphasize how can we actually start to ask the deeper questions of where is it that the things we consume every day come from? What do they mean to us? And I'm sure you understand this with woodworking, because furniture is a huge thing to think about. Where does it come from? Where are the things that we utilize every day? Where does it come from? And who made this? What energy went into producing this?
Yeah, exactly. And this is actually some of the topics I would like to get into with you, because on your channel, there's this thread running through it, thread of, of living intentionally. And I know you've talked about your Buddhist beliefs and this connection that we all have with nature. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that informs what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised Buddhist, I would say. Like, I also was raised in other spiritual beliefs as well. My father is very spiritual. And so I've always
Buddhism is very open to that, isn't it?
Yeah. So with Buddhism, it's a very there's different types of Buddhism, but with the Buddhism that I follow, there's no kind of hangups around being any other religion or having any other beliefs. And the thing for me is that I just personally feel that whatever I believe, it needs to create freedom in life and not oppress us. And so for me, Buddhism is a way of creating freedom, but I also have other beliefs, and there's some things in Buddhism that I don't agree with as well. So I just kind of call myself a Buddhist because to me, I feel like it sums up a lot of what I feel the best. But I don't think I'm like solely Buddhist, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
I think it's more of like a philosophy of how I choose to live my life, which is to approach life from a place of love and compassion, which I think is a really important core tenet in a lot of religions and in a lot of spiritual practices, at the root of it. And the other thing that I also really have gotten quite into is Tengrism, which is the religion of my Tatar ancestors before they converted to Islam in 922 AD. So they were shamanistic, like a lot of indigenous people in the world are or were. And it's a really cool religion where Tengri is the god of the sky. So he's like this sort of omnipresent force. He's not like one thing necessarily. I mean, Tengris as well, they have different beliefs depending on who you ask. But it's more like this kind of entity, like this powerful energy that exists. And then there's like the father sky, which you hear a lot in a lot of indigenous American religions. There's the father sky. And then there's also Umayana, who is Mother Earth. And so there's like the feminine and masculine divine counterparts. And getting into Tengrism was a really sort of special practice for me. I take little elements from it because there's a lot to do with worshiping nature and ancestors and kind of just paying homage to the people who came before us and feeling as if we're never alone in anything. So I very often get this sort of image in my head of my ancestors from like the 1900s or 1800s in the sky, and they're like in the southern Ural Mountains, and I've been there a bunch of times because my grandmother used to live in the southern Urals where we're indigenous to, and I see them sort of standing there like these four women, and they're wearing Volga Tatar clothing, and they're just staring at me, and so I get this like recurring image in my head all the time. And what it does is that it causes me to never forget that I'm firstly connected to nature, and there's no way that any of us can remove ourselves from nature. So even if we're in the city and we have every distraction in the world to make us forget that we're in nature, it's still there. The trees are still there. The birds are still there, even if they're pigeons. There's no way to get around it. And the other thing that it reminds me of is that I'm never alone in what I'm going through. And so I've managed to get through really difficult things in my life because of partially just knowing that I have this sort of something bigger than myself holding me through it, even if it's just my ancestors that came before me or nature itself. It doesn't even have to be anything super specific, but just this feeling of like, okay, I'm going to be okay.
It really is the past looking in on the present and what you're doing and kind of providing you with that sense of comfort, it sounds like.
Yeah.
I know on your channel you've talked a bit about your own mental health struggles, and I'd like to touch on that a little bit and see how has all of this beliefs and your philosophy and your reverence for nature kind of affected not just the work you're doing, but your mental health.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was diagnosed with complex PTSD, and I had like a really difficult childhood, and I endured like a lot of really traumatic stuff when I was a kid. And it really destroyed my life when I became an adult. And also in my teenage years, I have struggled continuously with my mental health. I mean, and to the point where I've been quite literally debilitated. There were points where I couldn't leave the house for 3 months because I was so afraid of everything, and there were other points where just I almost never felt relaxed. This feeling of like you almost get tingles on your skin because you can just relax completely, and you can like feel the sun on your face again and the wind blowing through your hair, and You're just very in your body. It's taken me a long time to get there again. I mean, I think I was there as a kid, but for most of my life until just my recent work with therapy in the last year, I've felt so on edge constantly in my body. And you can see it in my earlier videos. Like sometimes people now will comment constantly, in fact, about how I seem so much happier and I seem like I have so much more joy in me. And it's because I do. I'm alive now. Like I feel like I'm finally alive again. Mm-hmm. And it's so hard because I was in therapy for 6 years or 5 years before I found my current therapist. And I was doing everything right. I was doing the yoga, the meditation my whole life, the eating all the right foods and taking the supplements and working with professionals and going into treatment programs that were like super expensive that had really good results. And I just wasn't getting better. And it was so incredibly frustrating because I was always trying to advocate for my mental health and get support like they say to do. And it's because I mostly was doing therapy that was intellectualizing what I went through. But the thing about complex PTSD is a lot of the work is somatic. So it's in your body, and you actually have to work oftentimes with someone who knows how to do somatic work, because that is where I think some of the deeper healing with post-traumatic stress disorder comes from. Because your body holds on to your trauma often way longer than your mind does. And so, working on the body level is really scary, I think, for a lot of people who have complex PTSD, because you get a lot of physical symptoms. So like I've been dealing with health issues this whole year so much because when you start doing EMDR work, it starts to often unearth a lot of the stuff that you've been sort of holding in for years. And so, like the weirdest kind of sensations, like I used to get these things called brain shakes, where it feels like someone's taking your brain and just shaking it profusely. And the first time it happened to me, I genuinely thought I was dying because it was so scary. I thought I was like having like a stroke or something. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And this is something that a lot of people with complex PTSD experience. So I think that's the thing about a lot of these conditions, is that people don't realize how much it affects you physically, not just mentally. So mentally, you might be able to like somewhat get through your day, but when you're dealing with gut issues, migraines, fatigue, brain shakes, like all of these things that make life even more unbearable, it's really hard to just function. And I think that that's the biggest misconception about mental health, is people treat it like it's separate from the body, but it's not. It's all interconnected. And so because of that, I think people don't take it sometimes as seriously as breaking your leg or something like this. But in reality, it's just as serious. And
Yeah.
the other thing too is breaking your leg usually has a pretty straightforward treatment program. Mental health is a little bit different. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
individualized. It's really complex.
Yeah. And plus, you break a leg, people get to sign your cast, and they all think it's kind of cool in a way, and that sort of thing. But there
Yeah.
is this stigma attached to mental health. Was there like a turning point for you working with the therapist? And did your therapist incorporate kind of what you were already working on, such as your historical fashion, into that therapy?
Yeah, so no, there's a huge separation for me between my craft and my therapy. So like
Hmm.
my therapy is very somatic oriented. So we work a lot with sensations in my body. So what we'll do is we'll take past triggers, usually something that happened like within the last week, something in my general day to day that caused me to react in some way. And one of the things I know is that like I have certain cues that my body gives me that tells me that I'm triggered. It's not just like anxiety. It'll be something like I'll feel really flushed or I'll get like a headache all of a sudden. So I can understand, okay, I'm having a trigger right now. So then I can come to her with this information and then we can start to work and see what happens. And EMDR is really interesting because you don't always know why it's working or why it's helping you, but it just does. And so you have to kind of trust the process with it. So the most random memories from my past sometimes will appear as we've taken a trigger from something that happened to me in the last week. And all these things end up connecting and you can't really figure out even how they connect. But the point is that you don't really need to try and make sense of it intellectually because your body is going to make sense of it anyways. So all that matters is that your body gets that feeling in the treatment, and not so much about trying to figure out the exact point in time when something happened and how this
Right.
impacted you. That can be really helpful, I think, for a lot of people to talk about stuff. But I just found for me that at some point I already had a really deep awareness of what was going on for me, but I really was not getting better. And it's because I avoided doing the somatic work because it was really, really scary. And now it's not scary. Now I
Well,
like go into therapy and I'm like, yeah, this is great. Let's do the next thing.
yeah. And so you're on the mend physically, at least. You're able to kind of manage those, or at least acknowledge the physical symptoms that come up.
Yeah, I've been dealing with really severe health issues actually now for the last 5 months. And so I'm still kind of recovering from that. But I think that I'm finally starting to be on the mend with that. It's at least improving after like a lot of really frustrating months. But
Yeah.
I've kind of just accepted that I need to just give it some more time and space, keep doing my treatment, and things will heal themselves. It just is a matter of, I think, being okay with where you're at. I think anyone that deals with chronic illness has to have an incredible amount of mental fortitude to be able to endure the day to day, just sort of
Right.
what you deal with. And a huge part of this, I think, is having like a really deep sense of acceptance that like maybe this is just your limit for today,
Hmm.
and that doesn't necessarily mean that every day is going to be the same.
Right. And not to belabor this issue or anything, but what advice would you have for somebody who's feeling this kind of anxiety, even PTSD, and is kind of afraid to seek treatment or doesn't even know where to seek treatment? What would be a good first step for somebody?
Yeah, so I think one of the main things is, as I always tell people, don't stop seeking support. I think this is one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given because it's often that you have one therapist and like maybe you don't connect. It's like dating, like maybe you go on a date with someone and it doesn't really work out. So you don't just give up on dating forever. And so
Yeah.
I think it's the same with therapy as
Just
it's
swipe
like,
right.
yeah, yeah. 'Cause I hate that that's like our world though, where so it's so like, I don't know, this it's so impersonal in that way. But
Yeah.
yeah, but with therapy, it's like it's similar, like if you don't connect with a therapist, keep looking for another therapist and another modality, another type of therapy. There are so many ways to find mental wellness
Yeah.
nowadays. You just have to keep trying things and not give up on yourself.
Yeah. What does living intentionally mean to you? Because this is a big
Hmm.
topic that's been my life over the past few years.
That's a really good question. Hmm. By the way, everyone, Steve did not send me any of the questions before this.
No, I never even know what I'm going to ask.
Yeah, I love it. I actually love that so much. I'm a really spontaneous person, so I love I love just these types of conversations.
Good.
Yeah, living intentionally to me is paying respect to all the energy that went into creating what I consume every day. Whether it's the food that I eat, or the furniture that I sit on, or the clothing that I wear, or the makeup that I use, I want to at least feel like I can sort of imagine who made it and like what went into the process of it, if not even just directly understanding it. Part of my interest in clothing actually came from being really interested my whole life in permaculture and regenerative agriculture. So I grew up eating organic food because my mother actually used to grow a lot of our food. And in general, growing food is a massive part of Volga Tatar culture as well. Like anyone who lives in the country village will often grow their own food. It's still a very big part. And so, yeah, I just grew up around thinking about food cultivation. And, you know, I used to read these little facts as a kid, like, where do peanuts come from? And kind of I'd look up like how the peanut was grown and see sort of like the really interesting way in which it exists. And I think there's like this huge disconnect is like, so if you envision a pomegranate, can you envision the tree that was growing that pomegranate?
No.
Exactly.
No idea.
Yeah, and so there's this huge disconnect that we have now from our food. So for me, living intentionally is about sort of closing up those gaps and going, I want to know what the pomegranate tree looks like. I want to know what the person who stitched this garment looks like, or what their name was, if possible. And that's one thing I have here now is like, for a lot of the food I eat, I know the person that either grew it by name. Like I'll ask my, so I like get a lot of stuff organic from like a market, a very specific market. And I always ask them, hey, what's the name of the farm, or what's the name of the person that grew this? Because I want to be able to have that connection. And then also that practice goes into the deeper practice of, I think we really need rituals in life. Rituals are something that we've often lost touch with. And it's something that Indigenous people really used to have really deep connections with historically. Ritual was a core tenet of a lot of Indigenous communities for many, many years. And one of the kind of daily rituals that I will do is when I eat, I take a moment to close my eyes and I think about the process of at least one of the ingredients of my food from the moment it was planted or raised to the moment it ended up on my plate. And I just sort of have this deep sense of gratitude and paying gratitude to the people who went into raising that food, or even just to the plant itself. And to me, that creates a really deep sense of connection and interconnectedness to not only to nature, but also to every other sentient being.
Yeah. Do you have any of these kind of rituals, like seasonal rituals? I know I had Jacqueline Suskin on this show, poet, who has a book on like seasonal rituals and how the changing times of the year can affect her livelihood, her work, and just her general disposition. So she establishes rituals associated with the changing of the seasons and the nature.
Yeah, I think it happens for me intrinsically. So, for instance, when autumn hits, I sort of go into this death mode, I call it. It sounds dark and morbid, but I can like almost...
It's right up my alley.
Yeah, woo! I have like a really dark sense of humor. I think this is something that doesn't really show on my YouTube channel. But yeah, I have a really dark sense of humor. And in fact, I have a death positive outlook. So I'm really interested in conversations around death and dying. And I think one of the things
that is so totally up my alley. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I love is like, first I love Ask a Mortician, one of the best YouTube channels.
She's great, right?
Yeah.
Oh, she's amazing.
So one of the conversations that I often have with my friends is like, how do you want to be after you die? Like, do you want to be buried? Do you want to be cremated? This and that. So I think that this is something that is a really beautiful way to connect deeper with the people you love, because it's so vulnerable and tender. And it's such it's actually really empowering to become at peace with death and dying, because then you really start really living your life, I think, because you recognize that everything is transient, everything is impermanent. And this is something Buddhism talks about all the time. There's literally a prayer where we like think about death and dying, like we just pray on death. And for a while, like, this used to terrify me. And then it was through my work on myself and just getting more comfortable with grief, I think, that I really started to get softer around the idea of dying one day. And then now I'm kind of like, I'm not like hoping it happens anytime soon, obviously, but I'm sort of like curious, at least, like, what is it?
You do kind of come to terms with that at some point, and I think it's great. At such a young age, you're obviously kind of embracing, at least even thinking about this sort of thing, because I do kind of believe the same, that we are here for this limited time, and especially because I don't have any particular strong beliefs in an afterlife, everything I do here right now has much more weight and meaning to it than if I could defer that to an afterlife. So I do tend to like to think of death as feeling as the same as it did before I was born.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's, a beautiful way to look at it as well. And also, like, that's probably part of living intentionally as well, is because if we're aware of there being an end, then we can choose to live very presently now, because that's what we have in front of us. And so that goes back into, how do we live intentionally? One of them is just really trying to exist in the now and what's showing up.
Well, that's a beautiful way of looking at life. But you know what I got to ask you about? Okay, this is going to be totally switching gears.
Okay.
Set the record straight on corsets. What's the deal? Because it's like, it seems like every time you hear about these, people either cosplaying or being in movies, and they love to joke around about, oh my God, the corsets were so binding and they were painful and everything. But that's just not true, is it?
Yeah, well, so I don't want to deny their experience. I fully believe that for them, their corset was uncomfortable, but there's some reasons potentially why.
They just had a bad costume designer or something.
Well, yeah, and the problem that the film industry, as someone who like has a deep insight into it, and I have a lot of friends that work very directly in the film industry, the issue is that there's like, it's really time constrained, and there's like always missing budget, and people are having to work these really horrendously long hours, and people are exhausted and they're stressed and they're tired. It's not really a great state for creating, firstly, really high quality stuff, and then also like really creative stuff. And so it's kind of the opposite environment of what you need to produce a piece of art, like a masterpiece in a way. I don't even know how people manage to do it, to be honest, with the kind of pressures of the film industry.
It is mind-boggling, especially with so many people working on these projects. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and no one even really thinks about all the little roles that go. They're not even little. They're huge roles that go into making films, and there's just so many important roles that people just don't even realize exist. Like, I'm a colorist. Do people think about colors? Probably not, but it's a huge role, and it's really important, and it like totally influences the style of a film a lot of the time, and the emotion. But with that being said, I think that the costume departments, they're often incredibly talented. They know what they're doing. It's just that they, frankly, probably don't have the budget or the time to really fit a corset, because one of the things about corsetry is you firstly want to get bespoke corsetry if possible, something that is made to your measurements. And secondly, you want to give it time to soften and to sort of like leather shoes, everything has to take time to soften. So the first couple weeks of wearing a new corset is usually going to be not as comfortable as once you've already worn it in and it's already shaped to your body. And the other thing too is they often don't put an underlayer underneath the corset, which is like very concerning, because corsets were never worn on bare skin. That's not like a thing historically at all. They were just like alternatives to a bra, So it's like, yeah, bras are worn on the skin, but with corsetry, people didn't have access to washing clothes like we do now. So to put an underlayer meant that you could wash your underlayer a lot, and then your outer stuff didn't have to get washed as often. So I think there's a lot of reasons why corsetry has this sort of demonized persona in the world. And one of them is that I think they're just not really necessarily made to measure, which is really important, and not worn with the proper undergarments, and also not really given the time to soften. And the other thing too is that tight lacing is not really a thing a lot historically.
Yeah, you always have this vision, this there's like this stigma around the people with their foot against the person pulling that tight and just trying to cinch it all up.
It's not like that at all. So firstly, some bodies will not even cinch in that much. Like I think when I wear corsets, I can't really get my waist in more than an inch. And I don't want that. I don't wear corsets because I want to have waist reduction. I wear it because of the back support, the fact that it's this foundational underskeleton that kind of you build everything else on top of it. It's sort of like the framework of a house. You want like a solid foundation because then everything else kind of fits nicely and it lays correctly. And it just also, like with petticoats and stuff, they're not super, super heavy. I mean, it depends which ones and how many you wear. But one thing about corsetry and padding as well, too, because there's a lot of padding involved in historical fashion. When you put petticoats and skirts on top, you can't even really feel the weight of them because the corset is this like framework. So it just sort of holds all that weight for you. So people think historical fashion is super heavy, but when you're actually wearing it, you can't really feel the weight of it.
So there's a really practical purpose for wearing a corset. And I would imagine that, if they were commonly worn, they couldn't have been that horrible at the time, or women probably just wouldn't have worn them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that the way that they were worn is not how we think today. Like just the fact that things aren't tight-laced is huge. It's just like wearing I don't know, like I don't even know what to compare it to nowadays, like a rigid bra. I don't know, something to just give you a little support.
Well, how did these myths come about? Why is this such a pervasive cultural myth about the corset?
There's a thing about it being a patriarchy thing. So there's a thing with especially the late 19th century, you start to get a lot of women that are running fashion houses, and they're being bosses, they're running companies. And one thing that we always confuse in the world is people think that women didn't work. Women worked so much historically. Women still work all the time, of course. And so this idea that women just lounged around at home all day and had their little hobbies is so false. The reality is that they were in the mines. They were on the shores gutting and cleaning fish. They were tending to livestock and doing laundry. Laundry is like the most intense workout if you're doing it by hand. There's the amount of sheer strength, physical strength that you have to wash these heavy linens by hand and wring them out it's incredible. And I think that part of this issue is that when we look at people historically, there's an idea, firstly, that they were very unintelligent, which is not true. People were always incredibly intelligent. I'm not saying that they were perfect. There's definitely so many corrupt things about history that I'm not okay with. But people have always been geniuses. Today, people are geniuses. They were geniuses 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and they were just working with what they had available to them. So maybe they weren't coding AI, but they were, creating the wheel or, creating the telephone. They were creating these incredible things that we still use today. And so that's one thing, is that we kind of project this idea that people were unintelligent onto people of the past. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is that this idea that everybody was upper class, which is something that movies
like Pride and Prejudice or something we're always thinking of.
Yeah, the reality is 99% of people probably were working class and, had intense lives where they had to do all sorts of hard things to survive, just like today. Lots of people are trying to survive. And I think that's partially where this idea comes from with corsets, and the demonization of corsets is when you get this period where women start owning companies and they start really kind of taking on these roles that are seen historically as being more like masculine or men's roles, which I don't agree with. Because I own a business. Like I definitely don't agree with that. And I think that in a way to demonize the corset was a perfect way to belittle women historically, because ironically, men also sometimes wore corsets, and they were typically like the dandies that were like usually dressed really fancy and stuff like this.
You're basically describing me.
Okay, are you a dandy?
No.
You need to get a corset now, and then you're good.
I'm on it.
And a little top hat.
Yeah, all right.
But yeah, so I think because corsetry is so centered around connected to women, I think that it was kind of a way to like belittle or call women as being less intelligent than they are, because this foolish woman, she's wearing a corset and she's gonna kill herself, and with the corset, and she's like harming herself. Women are so vain and so so obsessed with their appearances, when in reality, if you're working a hard labor job all day, you want the back support. Think about weightlifters. They're wearing a weightlifting belt because they need the support on their back. If you're doing laundry and carrying 40 kilos all day on your back, or maybe more, you need the support. And it's true. Like I'm actually a very physically active person. And the way that I feel if I'm doing physically laborious work, wearing a corset versus how I feel if I'm not wearing a corset, it does make a huge, huge difference.
What are some of like the advantages that you see to wearing historical clothing every day? What is this like to just wear this type of clothing? And from what I gather in your videos, it's very layered. It's lots of different layers of fabric you're wearing.
Yeah, so the thing about layers is that you can take off layers. And so I think that that's the cool thing about layers, is it creates a much more versatile sort of system of dress. And I think every layer sort of has a really specific purpose. So your underlayer is there for cleanliness, so you don't have to wash your outer layers as much, for comfort. Also just for support, like with corsetry and padding, or creating a specific sort of silhouette, which would have been fashionable at a period in time. But yeah, I think for me, like the thing that has shocked me the most about historical clothing is how I probably just will not go back to modern, because I'm so much more comfortable. It's just like the materials and the cuts of things. And I mean, when we say historical fashion, this is a pretty broad and vague term. So historical fashion can mean so many things. It can mean many periods of history. It can also mean many locations historically too. Like, I would say that my experience wearing my Volga Tatar clothing is much different than when I wear Victorian clothing. There's a huge sort of difference in the feeling and in the practicality of it, and just different things like this. And so, like, for instance, my Volga Tatar clothing, I feel much more connected to myself and my ancestors when I wear it, but I don't find that I get the same back support because I don't wear corsets underneath it, because we didn't wear corsetry historically as a community and as people. So versus Victorian clothing, I feel the back support, but I don't have that same kind of deep intrinsic connection to my ancestors, because my ancestors were not Victorians. And so, that's a huge difference. And, but I think just I know it sounds like it might be inconvenient or kind of superfluous to wear all these layers and to wear all these extra garments, but in reality, I feel so incredibly comfortable because I feel like I'm sort of prepared for anything, and that gives me a deep sense of safety and security. Yeah. Because if it gets really cold, I can have my layers ready, and I know that my clothing is designed for that. I know that.
What would you do if it's like really cold? Do you have like what kind of a garment would have been worn? A coat? There's not really like a coat, right? It would just be more layers.
It depends like what era, or so for instance, Victorians would wear like there's coats, there's also capes and cloaks. For Volga Tatars, we have like fur coats that were worn, fur and wool coats, as well as a vest called kamzul. So you wear like the dress, then you wear the vest over that, and then you wear like shawls usually, and you wrap it on your head, and then you wear like a big fur hat, and you wear the coat over all of that, and you wear also like these shoes that are called valinki. In Russian, at least, they're called valinki. So for anyone that speaks Russian, you'll know the shoe. It's this like wool molded shoe that kind of like fits to your foot. I used to wear them as a kid, actually, whenever I'd be in my grandmother's village. Because we would sometimes go in the winter and it'd be like -30. We're like at the top of the Ural Mountains. It's freezing. There's nobody for hours. And so valinkis are very important. They're helping protect your feet from the cold and from the wetness of the snow. So people just had their methods of staying warm. And that goes back to them being intelligent, is people didn't wear these things to torture themselves. They wore these things to protect themselves and keep themselves comfortable.
Yeah, because if I'm out in the cold for a little bit, I'm just helpless. I'm like, I don't know what to do. Help, get me a coat or something. These people would have known exactly what to do in these situations, I think.
And it actually frees up a lot of space in your mind, because once you get your layers down and you've like built up your wardrobe to the point where you feel really confident about it and you're pretty happy with how it is, you can pretty much instantly choose an outfit, because at least with my clothing, all of it matches. I often make matching sets. So I don't have to think like, oh no, how do I mix that and make it look nice or fashionable or feel good in it? All my clothes kind of work together, almost kind of like, I don't know.
Even from the different eras? So if you had a Victorian outfit you've made, would you combine any of that with the Volga Tatar outfit?
I personally would. And I think that if people want to be historically accurate, I guess not. But for me, I love to mix and match eras. And I also love to mix and match Victorian with Tatar clothing. So for instance, I have this like pink Victorian wrapper that I made. And then I made this Tatar kind of chest piece called Izu. And I would wear the Victorian wrapper and then put Izu over it, because I thought it was like this really charming way to kind of include the two together. And I kind of try and imagine historically, like as if a Volga Tatar went to go visit like Victorian England or something. And so they like wanted to keep this little part of themselves when they were visiting.
That's really cool. I know nobody's going to call you out on that. Nobody's going to come up to you.
Like, if they call me out, I'll be like, it's my clothing,
Exactly. Yeah. But I think that most people are probably not even aware of those kind of distinctions between the clothes that you're wearing.
Yeah. And I kind of like that too. When I go out, people don't even probably think about how much work and thought went into the stuff I'm wearing. But it's like my own little precious secret that I know how much my art means to me, but it doesn't necessarily have to be for anyone else.
Is that what you're talking about when you mentioned capsule wardrobe? Describe what that is?
Yeah, so a capsule wardrobe is usually like a number of items that you can mix and match. And it's something that's used in modern clothing a lot too. And so it can be done in historical clothing for sure, especially if you focus in on like one specific era and one specific region, if you're going for historical accuracy. And like I argue that historical accuracy isn't even necessarily that based in reality, because we have actually quite limited information about what people actually wore due to the fact that we don't have a lot of information on working class clothing. And that's, most people were working class. So most of the information in the photos and all the stuff that we have of people are upper class people, especially when we get to the point where people didn't have photographs like portraits and stuff. You had to have a lot of money to be painted in a portrait. And even with photos, people would have worn their best to take a photo, because a photo was a big deal. It's not like today where we can take photos of everything, which is really cool. But you would have a guy
who would travel from town to town, and maybe you'd have that one photo in your entire life.
Yeah, exactly. And that might be like the cherished thing in your family for like 100 years. And so so capsule wardrobes are kind of like, you can take a season, or I guess with historical fashion, you could take a specific era and season, and then you create a series of garments that you can mix and match between each other. So like in my mind, a capsule wardrobe for historical fashion would be like 5 bodices and 5 skirts in complementing colors that you could then like mix and match between one another.
Okay.
So I have not personally made one. I started to make one, and then I decided I wanted to make other stuff instead, which is kind of typical chaotic artist type behavior.
Love it.
But yeah, I think it can be useful for some people, especially if you struggle as a person with having to choose what you wear each day. Something like a capsule wardrobe can be really beneficial because it takes that off of your mind. You can just see in your wardrobe this set amount of garments, and then you can know that whatever you mix is going to work for you. But then the risk there is that if you suddenly decide that you want to wear different style clothing, you're limited to your capsule wardrobe. So that's kind of the con of it.
Before we go, I want to ask you, how does looking to the past kind of help to define your outlook on the present, or even your outlook on the future?
So the first thing is knowing not to repeat the past. That's really important. That's something that I think we constantly struggle with in this world. You think like, wow, we've been going through these types of cycles for hundreds of years. How come people haven't learned yet that, war is horrible and like that people need to be loving and compassionate towards each other? I'm just kind of perplexed by how the same sort of patterns keep recurring. So I think one of the huge things is knowing where to not make your mistakes in the future, learn from the people of the past, and try and shape a more peaceful and connected future for everybody, where everybody can feel safe and be well. That's my dream for the world, is I hope that everybody gets to live the lives that they deserve to, which is safe and happy and joyful and well. And the other thing is as well, taking the parts from our ancestors that were really clever and really ingenious and utilizing those in our present. So it's that balance of sort of taking the stuff that helps and leaving the stuff that harms. I think that that's kind of the key, at least for my own personal relationship with how I view people of the past. So I can take the beautiful visions I have of my ancestors and what they wore and the way that they made clothing, and then perhaps I can leave, the scarier parts that were really not helpful to our world at all, and try and work towards creating a better future for the next generations coming up.
Well, Vasi, the clothing you make is beautiful, and I love your outlook on life. Thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.